you have to be really careful when you come in as a government, to be careful to see what's on the table, what projects are there, and not to just basically flip-flop.
So the ATO looked at 4,000 of Australia's largest corporates, and they found that 1,253 of them, that's about 31% of their sample, paid absolutely no tax at all.
I think what we've learned a bit more about today is just how much flex there is in the labour force. People can sort of move in and out of or move themselves in and out of, I guess, eligibility depending on conditions.
We'd love a solution where cans are consumed by New Zealanders, recycled in New Zealand, and then made back into the metal that then goes into the next lot of cans.
The finance spokesperson for Labor, Barbara Edmonds, I mean, she's a tax nerd, right?
Welcome to the Weekly Wrap, where we go over the top video stories from the past week. First up, Labor's Finance and Infrastructure spokesperson Barbara Edmonds speaks with our political editor Brent Edwards on being constructive about infrastructure in the face of looming long-term challenges.
The government's finances still look dire despite spending cuts, and raises the question of how future governments can afford to deliver public services. To talk about that, I'm joined by the Labor Party's finance spokesperson Barbara Edmonds. Now, you obviously oppose the cuts they've made, and you think they're counterintuitive or?
Counterproductive. So if you look at the $2.9 billion to put towards landlords, that is putting $2.9 billion towards what most economists would say is an unproductive part of the economy. You know, it might have been a better choice for them, knowing we have quite a large infrastructure deficit of over $100 billion, to have put some of that money towards the infrastructure build. I mean, it would have covered some of Dunedin Hospital's costs and the IREX ferries, for example.
So you would have invested more there, spent more there. How would you have balanced it up, though, against the, sort of ongoing budget deficits and looking at debt levels? How comfortable are you about where the debt level should be?
So, first of all, under Grant Robertson, the fiscal savings program had started in that last year in 2023. It was quite clear he had said to his public servant CEs that they need to look at a 1 to 2% cut in their budgets. He believed that that 1 to 2% was a comfortable position because it didn't go down to frontline services. So that's an issue that we're starting to see now with the cuts that have been made across the public sector. And I do want to clarify for the people watching this, it's not just about the bureaucrats or the people in Wellington. That public service cuts is funding that goes right through to social service providers, goes through to kainga order house builders, so that filters right through the system and so through the economy. Looking forward, obviously, as most people know, Labor is in that process of developing what our tax policy would look like, also how our expenses to GDP, how our debt to GDP will be. So for me, it's about putting together, through the conversations I've had in the last 7 months as the finance spokesperson, and as well as what our party will come through with a mandate, I'm hoping, come end of November, what they want me to look at in order for me to pull together the fiscal plan. So I absolutely accept there are some really big long-term challenges for New Zealand, but I think that in the short term, when you look at where our productivity gaps are and where some of the investment is currently going, I think we do need to start investing more into that infrastructure, innovation and technology area.
But if you are investing more, spending more, does that mean borrowing more, or do you need to tax more?
And I think that's what we need to look at. Well, we look at, say, for example, the UK budget quite recently. They came through with quite large tax increases in some areas, but then they also looked at basically spending more money into some parts of their economy to, as they would say politically, to rebuild what was lost over the last, decade under the Tory government. You look at Australia. Australia's productivity compared to New Zealand is doing really well. The US has done incredibly well, given their Inflation Reduction Act. The Inflation Reduction Act had a number of initiatives around renewable energy sources. So that's where you kind of need to be able to help with that productivity gap, so you can help produce more goods, serve more good, provide and service more goods, so that you do get more tax revenue coming in.
So do you think that the current government, the way they've cut back on spending, that it's made the recession, if you like, worse this year than it needed to be?
I think what it's done is it exacerbated the current downturn, and exacerbated it in the sense that those that were already in a difficult position, it's making it worse for them. So, for example, we have lost a number of construction sector jobs, over 12,000 less construction sector roles. That's a really key part of our infrastructure sector that we need to try and hold on to that capability, because when the infrastructure program, if the government gets it started, we're going to need this capability to build what we need to do with schools, houses, hospitals, for example. So being out basically by slowing the economy down, by putting the handbrake on some of these big infrastructure projects, it means that we're losing the capability overseas. And that's not a good thing, because it takes a while to wind that back up and to bring back that capability and skills back into New Zealand.
But hasn't it also helped bring inflation back under control and led to the Reserve Bank cutting interest rates faster than originally expected, which presumably then will become a bit of a boost to growth? So
part of it is that this drop in inflation was already forecast. So if you look, for example, this morning I was looking at the budget 2022 BEFU, it showed that inflation was going to start coming down towards the end of 2023. So that was already going to happen. But what wasn't going to happen was the stopping of hospital builds and of housing builds. Hence why, again, you see that net record migration numbers going offshore for New Zealand, which is incredibly high. So again, it's a timing. We knew that inflation was going to start coming down, but what we also weren't going to do was put tax cuts back in and $2.9 billion to landlords. Instead, we could have used that money elsewhere in the economy.
I mean, the government is obviously working on the Infrastructure Commission is working on this National Infrastructure Plan. They've got some initial thinking out for consultation now. The Minister, Chris Bishop, has said he wants to be a bipartisan approach, and also they're looking for obviously private sector money to help invest in infrastructure. Do you agree with that, and where would Labour sit with that?
Yeah, so I'm absolutely open to foreign direct investment into New Zealand to help us build or reduce that infrastructure gap. And actually the conversations that I'm having both with the Minister and his officials, because he's given them permission, the Infrastructure Commission, to talk to me and to take them through their plans, really constructive discussions, and that because that's where Labour wants to be constructive. We know we have some really big long-term challenges. We know we need to get hospitals built. We know that in some areas we need to have better transport options. So this is why we're proactively working with the government on it. And I'm really happy to say that so far that relationship is being very open and we're working together well.
How do you see, though, the balance between government investment and any sort of private sector investment, whether it's domestic private sector investment or foreign in infrastructure?
And again, that all comes down to how you contract and finance and fund that infrastructure. So, for example, the government has a really clear view that for some large infrastructure projects, they want to use PPPs. Obviously, an element of it will be private investment. We've said that we're open for the right assets. And so it's really clear that for us, at least with Labour, we do need foreign direct investment. We want New Zealand. New Zealand's a great place to invest in. It's also a great place to live in. So it's just making sure that those settings are balanced to ensure that when these assets are built, that the government still has some oversight or some skin in the game to ensure that these assets in the long term are not sweated so that the government has to come at a later stage and have to fix it if it's not involved right throughout the project.
So, there's expectation that plan, the infrastructure plan, will be delivered end of next year. Would you expect the process to be that all the parties would kind of agree on it so that going forward, I guess the industry can have confidence that these things are going to continue to be built, whichever party leads the government?
I think I've shared it here on NBR before that one of the biggest lessons I've learned in coming into opposition, because I've always advised governments or been in government, is that you have to be really careful when you come in as a government, to be careful to see what's on the table, what projects are there, and not to just basically flip-flop. For example, the ferries. Really big flip-flop that happened there. So the Minister cancelled the ferries order when it was the infrastructure, the landside infrastructure, that was actually the major issue and where the cost escalation was going to happen. I'm not sure whether she received advice from Treasury or from her officials or anyone else to ask those port infrastructure, for example, down in Picton, they're needed anyway. And the people that were contracted to do it, did they have to invest in capital assets in order to build that infrastructure? Because it's underwater, so the seismic strengthening is happening underwater. So I think it's really important that there is continuity of those projects continuing. Where Labour, for example, if we see a project in the future that we're really clear that we are not comfortable with, or we're not comfortable with the contracting of it, we will be really clear very early on our position in relation to it. But going back to sort of removing the politics from it, and maybe rather than bipartisan, being non-partisan, this is where I think the infrastructure plan is a good place to start. It's a bit slow, if I'm really frank. It's, next year. Our infrastructure sector can't wait until next year. But the thing is what I've always said to both the minister and to, stakeholders in the sector, is that politicians can agree to the criteria in which these projects are selected, then that's where the politics is, I believe. Because it doesn't matter what project is picked, as long as the criteria covers aspects that ourselves, other parties, for example, can agree to, then we know it's been through a thorough criteria assessment or an analysis of it. There may be some issues around the projects that they pick, but again, get it right at the start. Let's agree to the criteria so that when the projects are picked, that's your political where you want to stand up and put shovels in the ground. But for us, as we come into government, we've seen that it's met the criteria that we agreed to with the government, then it looked really bad on us if we flip-flopped.
The corporate tax rate on profits in Australia is 30%. But anyone who has run a business of any size knows that the aim is to massage that profit figure and minimise the tax owing. In this week's Underarm column, Australian correspondent Lachlan Cahoon and co-editor Hamish McNichol discuss the slippery business of corporate tax over the ditch.
The issue of corporate taxation is always a hot topic in the world of business. And a recent report in Australia revealed how much tax leading corporates are paying or are not paying. Lachlan, why don't we start with what this report actually tells us?
Yeah, this is, Hamish, the ATO's annual report on corporate transparency. Now, remember that the corporate tax rate in Australia is 30% on profits. So the ATO looked at 4,000 of Australia's largest corporates, and they found that 1,253 of them, that's about 31% of their sample, paid absolutely no tax at all in the 2023 financial year. It brings to mind the old Kerry Packer quote in 1991. He was in a parliamentary committee and he said, "Of course I'm minimising my tax. And if anybody in this country doesn't minimise their tax, they want their heads read." Despite that, those figures on the 1,200 who are not paying any tax, the whole take was up across that 4,000 sample of corporates, up 17%. They paid $100 billion in tax across that 4,000.
So which companies have managed to avoid paying tax, though? How?
It's a roll call of some of Australia's biggest corporate names. Qantas, for example, they claimed $7 billion in losses from the COVID pandemic and managed to avoid paying tax at all. News Australia, Seven West Media. The report doesn't show how each of these companies individually paid no tax, but there is an analysis across the group. Around 40% of the losses were for accounting losses. Others cited losses from previous years, bringing them forward, and others used tax offsets like research and development grants. In terms of the biggest payers, these were the mining companies and the banks. They were dominated the top 10. And you'd have to say Rio Tinto was the biggest taxpayer among the corporates. They paid $5.7 billion in tax that year, which is significantly more than Qantas paid.
Often in these reports, multinational tax is a big issue as well. How's Australia responding to that?
Yes, the report did show how little tax multinationals were paying in Australia, and these were largely the big tech firms like Google, Facebook, and Microsoft. Amazon was probably the most extreme example, Hamish. They paid $125 million in tax. Sounds like a lot of money, but their revenues were 6.6 billion Australian dollars. So the government's tried to close these loopholes around transfer pricing and profit shifting. They've had some success. They've signed up to an OECD arrangement for a minimum tax rate of 15% for multinationals with about 140 other nations. But when you think that our corporate tax rate is 30%, there's a big difference between that and 15%. So there's still a big incentive for corporates to shuffle their domiciles and move their profits around to pay less tax in Australia.
In addition to corporate tax, Australia also calculates the so-called tax gap. What does that tell us?
Yeah, so this is the difference between what the ATO gets and what they reckon they would get if everyone complied. And that is across small business, corporate taxes, and also individuals. And so they claim that tax gap at the moment is worth $35 billion. So they say that compliance is at 92%, and it's increasing each year. Every time they do this report, it inches up just a little bit, and it's largely through digitisation, through the decrease in the use of cash, and there's more vigilance of the superannuation system, which is another way for money to leak out. So I think that the figures show that of that 35 billion, small business was responsible for 15 billion, and individuals were responsible for 10 billion. So there's a lot of money that's still leaking out of the system. I mean, in terms of cash, in 2007, 70% of all transactions were in cash. Now it's down to 10%. So they're making big inroads into the grey economy and the black economy, and so that tax gap can be expected to go down. But possibly, while that's changing, one thing that's not changing, and if I can quote Kerry Packer again, a comment that he made in 1991 still remains true, when he said, "As a government, I can tell you, you're not spending it that well that we should be donating extra."
And you can read more from Lachlan on that at mbr.co.nz. Stats NZ data this week showed unemployment rose to 4.8% in the September quarter, below expectations of 5%. Westpac senior economist Michael Gordon digests the data. Unemployment has risen to 4.8%. With us is Westpac senior economist Michael Gordon. So, Michael, it wasn't the 5% that many were expecting.
No, that's right. The unemployment rate did rise, just not as much as expected. Most of that miss, I think, was really around labour force participation. So we did see that drop in jobs that we were expecting. But what's happened is that it's the younger age groups in particular are really kind of moving out of the labour force altogether, seem to be going back into things like study. And that is, to a large degree, it's sort of an echo or a payback from what we saw in previous years. You might remember during the kind of the post-COVID era, we had really severe labour shortages, couldn't get migrant workers because the border was closed, and we actually had a lot of young people were brought into the workforce to fill those roles, and now we're seeing the reversal of that.
So the unemployment and generally the labour market is playing catch-up to how the economy is performing right now?
Yeah, certainly. It seems to be responding with its usual kind of lag. The economy has been in effectively a recession, although it's been a relatively shallow one. It's been there for really 2 years now. And we've seen initially the labour market was kind of slow to respond, but it's coming through more clearly now. And it's actually only recently that we've actually seen a turn to an outright fall in employment. Part of that was because last year we had a lot of migrants coming in. There were just more people, so there were more jobs and more people working. But now we're kind of really sort of seeing both the reversal of well, not the reversal, but the easing of the migration surge, but also just hiring is very soft at the moment. And on balance, we're actually seeing more people out of work.
Are you expecting unemployment to go above 5% still?
Yeah, we'll look at what we do with the forecast. In our last published forecast, we had it peaking at about 5.5% next year, and then a kind of gradual improvement after that as we see the economy picking up. I think given what we've seen today, the risks are that it doesn't peak as high, but it's at the same time, it doesn't necessarily change where we see the longer term path. I think what we've learned a bit more about today is just how much flex there is in the labour force. People can sort of move in and out of, or move themselves in and out of, I guess, eligibility depending on conditions. So when we see the next economic upturn, there's actually a bunch of people that will be starting to hit the workforce about that time anyway.
So when will businesses start to hire again?
That's a great question. Certainly, if you look at business confidence surveys, they're certainly feeling pretty optimistic in general, or at least they say they are. When you ask them more specific questions about, or are you going to hire more, are you going to invest more, there has been a pickup, but it's been a more modest one. So, and I think ultimately it's probably, we normally see a pickup in those things once we actually see an improvement in profitability. So it's a little bit of maybe not chicken and egg, but which one needs to come first? They need to feel like there's actually something in the budget to start hiring people. So effectively, we're kind of really talking. It's probably more into middle of next year, but before we're starting to see some improved growth numbers and maybe a turnaround in employment.
So this data sets the scene for the Reserve Bank later this month?
Yeah, this is really the last big data point before that Reserve Bank review. And that in turn is the last one that they'll be doing for 3 months after that. So I think a lot of people were hoping that today's numbers would tell them something decisively about what the Reserve Bank is going to do next. And I don't think we sort of really got more out of that. If you thought they were going to do a 50-point cut later this month, I don't think there's anything here that would dissuade them from that. If you were hoping for something that says they're going to do a jumbo 75-point cut, sorry, there's nothing in this to support that either.
Okay, so where are you picking? Where are you? 25, 50?
We're picking a 50. I mean, I guess the matter of individual Reserve Bank decisions, it's as much tactics as it is about the economics. But I think considerations like they see themselves as being quite a way from a neutral setting. So the idea at the moment is they're looking to kind of take the foot off the brakes and get back to some sort of more long run neutral level, which they see it as about 3%. So on that basis, they think there's quite a way to go. But in terms of how they do that from step to step, there are considerations like there's a 3-month gap. Also, markets are already pricing a 50-point cut, pretty close to bang on for that anyway. Is it worth picking a fight with the markets about that when everyone agrees on the direction that rates are heading anyway?
Where would inflation be now then, the midpoint?
Well, I mean, we're pretty close to the midpoint now, and I guess the issue is that do we then see a risk that the Reserve Bank's overdone it? And the test of that would be, do we end up with inflation meaningfully below 2% for any length of time? And that's not really our view. Certainly it can go below 2, but it's not a hard target anyway. There's lots of flexibility in the target band. It's not speed. It's not like we go below 2% and the economy explodes. So at the moment, it still looks like they, on path for, I guess, a relative soft landing in the sense of sort of heading towards a kind of notion of neutral rather than having to actually, lower interest rates a lot and put the foot on the accelerator again to try to get things going.
Give plastic the middle finger. That's the Kiwi battle cry from Rob Fyfe and Bruce Parton's $140 million can-making startup, Recorp. Will Mace goes on location to talk challenging not only the drink packaging duopoly in New Zealand, but also the economic model behind single-use plastics.
Here we are, Bruce, in this shiny new factory. Give me the pitch. What are we seeing here today?
Yeah, so what you're seeing is, first of all, a huge investment. Our shareholders have spent an enormous amount of money in order to change the landscape for aluminium cans in New Zealand. We are a believer that this is the product of the future. I think we've all seen all of the news footage on plastics and some of the dangers on there. And so we're seeing at a customer level the need for more aluminium cans, and we're looking to provide the market with that. When you go out to the factory, you see the very latest in technology. It's 100 million plus of equipment out there. It's incredibly sophisticated. Our partners have done an amazing job of pulling it together. And what that factory now does is give us flexibility. And so that flexibility enables us to move from one can size or printing type to another relatively easily. And when you look and say, why does that matter? Because being able to do that quicker means that it's less expensive for our customers. And so our minimum order quantity that you can order from us is around 30,000, which is far, far lower than the market has seen. And if you're a brewing house or something in New Zealand and you want to do a small run, that means you can do a 30,000 run, put it into the market and make it successful. which is incredibly important for the customers and those businesses.
Yeah. What, in terms of the market here in New Zealand, I know that there's a lot of imports still. So what's the market dynamic going to be like once you're up and running? And who are you really targeting in terms of the customers, the top end of town, or as you say, kind of the innovators, the smaller end?
Yeah, so with the technology out there, we've spent an additional $10 or $15 million on having this flexibility so that we can really target the bottom end of the market. So if you're producing hundreds of millions of cans, then the ability to change over is of less importance to you because you're changing over once every few months. Whereas for small companies, they need to change over all the time. They're doing small runs. And so that equipment that we've invested in is really targeted at the bottom. So it would be a real shame to then use that $10 million worth of equipment and have it sit idle. So we really see ourselves at this bottom end of the market working with small businesses. We're very customer orientated. We come from, Rob and I and others on the board come from a background where the customer is right, where the customer is everything. And you'll see us just in the marketplace really playing that out and trying to develop those small businesses that are the lifeblood of New Zealand and making them into bigger businesses.
And so the factory itself, how do the economics work, and how are you going to sort of ramp up production to get to a point where you're turning a profit?
Yeah, so the first stage that we're in at the moment is we're making a ton of cans out there. It's now to get the equipment as efficient as possible. At full capacity, we're doing about 1,850 cans a minute, so it's going pretty fast. The next phase is then to start bringing in additional shifts. Our aim is probably around April next year to bring in a second shift, and that will enable us then to obviously double capacity. We see that being pretty static for probably a period of time. It's dependent a little bit on how fast customers move from plastic bottles into aluminium cans and really what the market wants insofar as innovation. And so we'll look to support that innovation as best we can and be part of it, and that may see increases in the volume. And then we see probably in the third and fourth year of operation us having the third and fourth shift coming in.
And so that may also see added investment from the investor group that's currently here to bring on different phases of the production?
Yeah, so the next investment is probably not in the additional shifts. That's small, it's labour. The next phase is really we're looking at bottles in New Zealand. So glass bottles overseas are being phased out slowly across the world and being replaced by aluminium bottles, and we're seeing that across in particular Asia and Europe. So we'll be looking at that. We'll also look as to whether there is an opportunity for an additional line to increase our capacity, but again further down the line. And then the other much smaller elements are really around emissions, wastewater, things like that, where we can just constantly look to reduce the amount of waste and planetary harm that we do in order to try to be as efficient as possible. We know it's really efficient now, but there's areas that we can look at that we'll look to improve that will require some small investment.
Mm-hmm. Okay, yeah, on that side, tell me about the raw inputs you've got here. Obviously there is aluminium smelted in New Zealand, yep. But you're importing the milled product from China, right?
Yep. So we, like all of the can makers in New Zealand, import the metal. There is no ability to do it in New Zealand. At this stage, the market's too small for that to be viable. We've had an initial look, but depending on how many or how fast, I guess, people come across from plastic bottles to aluminium cans, that might change the picture. And we're working both with some of our shareholders and with others to really look at that as a next phase. We'd love a solution where cans are consumed by New Zealanders, recycled in New Zealand, and then made back into the metal that then goes into the next lot of cans. That might have to be in a series of stages. We'll look at that as well, but that would be just the absolute aim down the path. It's just how fast we can get that delivered is the real question.
Okay. I mean, it sounds like the investor group and the board and Rob are really dedicated to this cause. What has been some of the real challenging parts of getting this up and running?
Yeah, so first of all, this is a big venture, obviously. Just the technology and getting it all together, bringing it in, getting it set up. We've had some challenges out on the factory floor with making sure that the footings are stable enough. That whole process took longer than we'd like. Now that it's there, it's all about making the factory as efficient as possible, and then looking to take this forward in a series of stages. So just each stage with improving, whether it's our factory itself, whether it's then what the market does. But I see the real challenge for us and where this is going is just working with our customers really strongly. We've already seen that when we start working with our customers, we can very quickly produce options for them that make them more efficient. And if they can be more efficient, then more customers will come across to aluminium cans, which is what we want.
And are you feeling like you've obviously been out there talking to potential customers and customers that have come on board? Are you feeling like you've got good coverage of the market here at the moment? Yeah,
we do. We've got good coverage in all of the different can types at the moment. Right now we've got more cans than we can produce, so that's always a good thing for a business. And as we continue to grow, we've got a whole lot of customers who are coming on board either later this year and into next year. So that's a good position. Our challenge now is to make sure that with that customer group, we just over-deliver for them. We want to be the company who promises and then over-delivers. And so that's really where our focus will be in the next couple of months, making sure that our customers talk about us in high regard with accolades, and they're so glad they've come with us. Because in the end, that's how you create a customer-led business. And that's something that we take very seriously and are very strong on, as you see from our board members who will have a background in that kind of approach.
If you've got more orders than you can produce at the moment, is there a temptation to go a bit quicker with your increasing the shifts, or is it really just a set timetable?
No, it's not so much increasing the shifts, it's just us getting more efficient. So as we're bringing on the equipment, we're getting better and faster all the time. Our people out there are learning, so they're improving. So every week our number of cans per day is improving over and over. And we're also seeing, when we start up, we're doing a lot of training, a lot of practicing, etc. And now we're starting to get into, just running at full noise now, which is what we want. And
so cans per day, what's the eventual mass capacity?
So of the plant, so the theoretical maximum by the time you take cans per minute, then you take out maintenance and things, it's around 500 million cans a year.
Wow.
And so you take one shift, you've got obviously a quarter of that, 4 shifts.
Finally this week, Labour Party MPs can't spell it out just yet, but the party will likely have to adopt a more fiscally ambitious policy than it has in the past for the 2026 election campaign. Here's more analysis from our political editor Brent Edwards. The Labour Party looks set to loosen its fiscal rules after its annual conference at the end of the month. Let's bring in our political editor Brent Edwards. So Brent, what's different this time around?
Well, obviously parties on the centre-right will say, they're really loose for their fiscal sort of policy anyway. But, this time around, though, Labour Party, whether people disagree with it or not, did have some fairly clear set sort of fiscal rules going into the 2017 election, which they stuck to until COVID hit. And then, of course, things changed and they did it. But I think this time around they are going to be much looser in terms of, they had this net debt to GDP of 20% or even like, so I think they're going to loosen those sorts of parameters and clearly look again at the tax situation and, capital gains tax obviously on the agenda.
Okay, what does it need to avoid then this time around?
Well, what it needs to avoid is if as expected, it does come up with a capital gains tax proposal, a comprehensive capital gains tax that would take to the 2026 election, and there will be pressure in the party too, though, for actually to do more than that, to look at a wealth tax, but at the very least, you think capital gains tax. It's got to ensure that the tax is really robust and that it can be explained and the detail can't be picked apart. In 2011 and 2014, when it had a capital gains tax policy, on both occasions, the then leaders, Phil Goff and David Cunliffe, couldn't answer basic questions about the tax. They got caught out on the detail of the tax, and the National Party was able to attack it, particularly by claiming it would be on the family home, etc. And so it immediately put them on the defensive. So they need to make sure they've got the policy and the detail completely sorted and fine-tuned so that they can declare what the tax will tax and what it won't tax, and be very, very clear about that.
But is it likely to avoid those mistakes of the past?
Well, I think this time round, it's got a good chance, and partly because I think the finance spokesperson for Labor, Barbara Edmonds, she's a tax nerd, right? So you kind of think that maybe she will actually ensure that that work is done, and that both she and the party leader, Chris Hipkins, are very, very aware of what the detail is, and so that when questions are raised, they're not going to be caught out by stumbling over an answer and sort of suggesting, oh well, it might apply to this when in fact it shouldn't.
Would there still be a healthy debate though about tax?
Oh, absolutely. It won't stop the debate where the National Party and ACT will obviously criticise and attack Labor over being a spend more, tax more party. That basic difference between the centre-left parties and the centre-right parties will be there. So that's still going to be an issue. I guess the argument that Labor's going to put up, they're arguing, I think, that the fiscal policy needs to be a bit looser, in the sense that then, not that you just spend money willy-nilly, but they're arguing there needs to be more investment for growth. And that, and obviously the criticism or the opposition from National and ACT will be it is just about just spend.
So we'll be hearing about tax this year, next year?
I think, well, once the party conference is over, the idea is that then gives direction to Barbara Edmonds to then flesh out the policy. And I certainly would imagine from next year you'll see Labor talking in a lot more detail about their fiscal policy overall, so that's tax and spending and their various targets for debt to GDP and the like. But specifically on tax year, there'll be a lot more talk on tax. I want to have that policy well bedded in people's minds before the election campaign starts.
Thanks again for joining us. Our news team is back from 5 a.m. tomorrow with the latest business news you can use on mbr.co.nz, and join Mike McRoberts from 5:30 p.m. tomorrow for a look at the day's top stories. See you next week.